It's October of 1692. 20 innocent people have been executed for witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts. 7 more are condemned, and 50 are rotting away in prison, waiting for the general court to ultimately decide their fates in November. It's a dangerous time. People are terrified to speak out against the trials, fearful they will be accused of witchcraft if they do. Despite these dangers, on October 8, 1692, a letter was written to an anonymous reverend, the contents of which challenged the wisdom of the judges, the sanity of the afflicted, and the unfair methods used during court proceedings. It is believed that the letter was circulated among prominent figures in the community, and it may be no small coincidence that the court of Oyer and Termine dissolved just 21 days after the letter was penned. Anyone who is interested in learning about the witch trials should read it. I consider it to be one of the great letters of history, on par with MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail, which, coincidentally, is also addressed to clergymen. It's a long letter, 22 pages typed, and it took me about 43 minutes to record it. I put a link in the description below for those who would prefer to listen to it. The letter is signed only as TB, which we now know stands for the initials of Thomas Brattle, who was 34 at the time. Brattle was born in Boston in 1658 to one of the wealthiest families in the colony. He graduated from Harvard College in 1676, 2 years before Cotton Mather, whom he disliked. Brattle became a successful merchant, as well as treasurer of Harvard College for 20 years, up until his death in 1713. He was a self-taught mathematician and scientist, arguably the brightest in Boston. To put his intellect in perspective, during the winter of 1680, when Brattle was just 22 years old, he borrowed a small telescope to calculate a comet's position in the night sky over Cambridge. He sent these to the Royal Society in London, where they eventually found their way to Isaac Newton. Newton was so impressed with his observations that he actually referenced Brattle as, quote, the observer in New England in his now iconic Principia. At the time of the Salem witch trials, Brattle was a member of the Third Church in Boston, important to note considering the other members of the congregation. 3 were judges who served on the court of Oyer and Termine. 7 were accused of witchcraft, and 5 had expressed dissatisfaction, at least behind closed doors, about the proceedings. Even the Reverend of the South Church, Samuel Willard, was skeptical of the proceedings. During the height of the trials, historians believe that he anonymously penned this 15-page pamphlet, which passively raised concerns about the methods being used via the dialogue between 2 fictitious people. All of this turmoil was happening in Brattle's own church, to people he knew and attended Mass with, so there's no surprise that he followed the witch trials very closely. From his letter, we know that he visited the accused in prison, attended both preliminary examinations and court trials, as well as witnessed the executions. Keep in mind that Brattle is responding to specific questions asked of him from a now-lost letter. I've broken his responses into 8 sections. He begins the letter by voicing his respect for lawful authority, saying, "I would sooner bite my fingers' ends than willingly cast dirt on authority or any way offer reproach to it." At the same time, he notes that he never thought judges infallible, but reckoned that they, as well as private men, might err. The first part describes superstitious methods used during examinations, which, as a scientist, he found preposterous. Quote, "I cannot but condemn this method of the justices, of making this touch of the hand a rule to discover witchcraft." Using basic logic, Brattle demonstrates the absurdity of the touch and look method. Quote, "If these apprehended persons are witches, and by a look of the eye do cast the afflicted into their fits by poisoning them, how it comes about, I say, that, by a look of their eye, they do not cast others into fits, and poison others by their look." He then boldly claims that, quote, "the reasonable part of the world, when acquainted herewith, will laugh at the demonstration, and conclude that the said Salem gentlemen are actually possessed, at least, with ignorance and folly." The second part discusses the confessors, who Brattle believes are deluded and should not be trusted, especially if they are being possessed by the devil. Quote, "If the devil does actually take away the memory of them at some times, certainly the devil, at other times, may very reasonably be thought to affect their fancies, and to represent false ideas to their imagination." The third part focuses on the trials, and how the indictment is specific to sorcery and witchcraft upon the body of an individual at a specific date and time. And yet, nearly all the evidence brought forward against the prisoners are, quote, "altogether alien to the matter of indictment, for they none of them do respect witchcraft upon the bodies of the afflicted, which is the alone matter of charge in the indictment." He then destroys the credibility of those who confess to witchcraft. Quote, "Some of the confessors are allowed to give their oaths, a thing which I believe was never heard of in this world, that such as confess themselves to be witches, to have renounced God and Christ and all that is sacred, should yet be allowed and ordered to swear by the name of the great God. In Part 4, Brattle lists a number of things he sarcastically admires or wonders about. How, for instance, people with wealth and connections are given special treatment, despite being accused of the same crime. Quote, certainly distributive justice should have its course, without respect to persons. And although the said Mrs. Thatcher be mother-in-law to Mr. Corwin, I cannot see how, without injustice and violence to conscience, Mrs. Thatcher can escape, when it is well known how much she is, and has been, complained of. He then wonders how people could consult the afflicted children to determine who are witches, even though they hold correspondence with evil spirits. Quote, and yet this is not the worst of it, for, as sure as I now write to you, even some of our civil leaders and spiritual teachers who, I think, should punish and preach down such sorcery and wickedness, do yet allow of, encourage, yea, and practice this very abomination. He wonders how the justices can issue out warrants and apprehensions based on the word of the devil. Quote, if I believe the afflicted persons as informed by the devil, and act thereupon, this my act may properly be said to be grounded upon the testimony or information of the devil. In Section 5, Brattle expresses his lack of faith in Chief Justice Stoughton, who impatiently ignores contrary opinions. Quote, I cannot but say my great fear is that wisdom and counsel are withheld from his honor as to this matter. There are, however, still good, reasonable people, quote, several about the bay, men for understanding, judgment, and piety, inferior to few, if any, in New England, that do utterly condemn the said proceedings. Section 6 quickly clarifies a few details of his past assertions, such as, quote, 1. That when I call these the afflicted children, I would not be understood as though I meant that all that are afflicted are children. Part 7 recaps where they are now. After Brattle describes how many are in jail and how many have been executed, he then asks the Reverend to attend the assembly and offer direction in this weighty matter. He's very concerned for the future, saying, quote, our hopes are here, and if at this junction God does not graciously appear for us, I think we may conclude that New England is undone and undone. Finally, in Part 8, Brattle adds 2 or 3 points he forgot to mention earlier in the letter, one of which directly attacks the accusers. Quote, it is true, they may strongly fancy or have things represented to their imagination when their eyes are shut, and I think this is all which ought to be allowed to these blind, nonsensical girls. And he concludes his letter with, quote, I am afraid that ages will not wear off that reproach and those stains which these things will leave behind them upon our land. I pray God pity us, humble us, forgive us, and appear mercifully for us in this our moment of distress. So hopefully you can see how extremely well written this letter is just by these few points. The original letter does not exist. The only reason we know of it today is because of Thomas Brattle's grandnephew, who donated a manuscript of the letter to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1784. The group, in turn, published it in the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, volumes 61 to 79. When I requested to view this gifted manuscript, I was informed that it was not in their collection. Apparently, it was not unusual in the early years of the Society to publish documents of historical note while not retaining the original. As for the unnamed Reverend, historians still don't know who it could be. Although it's fun to wonder, all that matters is that the letter exists. Brattle showed a great deal of intellectual courage writing it, for many of the things said could have endangered his own life. By denouncing spectral evidence and unfair judicial proceedings, he showed that reason can still survive in a time of mass hysteria. For those who made it till the end, thanks for watching. I know sometimes my videos can be long, especially given the internet's attention span, but I'm really trying to create high-quality educational content on the Salem witch trials. A great deal of research is behind every video, so please be sure to like, subscribe, and support if you can.